The wind over Senlac Hill has barely settled. The banners have fallen, the cries have faded, and the last light of an Anglo-Saxon England slips away into the cold October dusk. But history does not pause in silence. While Harold Godwinson lies where he fell, another figure begins. His march, the man who believes the crown was promised to him. The man whose ambition will reshape a kingdom tonight. We return to 1066. To the day England's destiny tightened into a single line of shield and steel, to the battle that ended one world and began another. This is episode 2, the day England changed forever. Let's go back in time to that moment dawn. On the 14th of October, 1066 arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to unfold upon the slopes of Senlac Hill. A pale, colorless light seeped through the mist, painting the land in muted grays and cold whites. It was the kind of morning that seems suspended between worlds, not yet day, no longer night, and heavy with a silence so profound that even the crows circling overhead hesitated before calling out. Across this ridge, this final shield of Anglo-Saxon England, thousands of men stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath forming ghosts in the chilled air. They waited not because they wished to, but because history demanded it of them. At the center of the line stood Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. His cloak was drawn tightly against the cold, though much of the chill he felt came not from the autumn wind, but from the sheer magnitude of the moment. He looked older than he had only weeks before. Stamford Bridge had carved exhaustion into his features, and the brutal march south had added years that no chronicle would record. Yet his eyes, sharp and determined, revealed a man who refused to surrender even a sliver of hope. He did not speak. He did not need to. Around him, Housecarl's elite warriors, bound by personal loyalties, firm with their great axes planted in the soil. Their faces were not those of men expecting to live. They were the faces of men prepared to die well. Behind them, the ordinary levies summoned from towns and shires shifted nervously, gripping spears and shields that suddenly felt far too light for the task ahead. They all knew this was not just another battle. This was the hill upon which their world might end. From the crest, the English shield wall looked like a colossal wooden serpent coiled tightly, shimmering with interlocked shields painted in the colors of dozens of local lords. It was more than a formation, it was the embodiment of Anglo-Saxon identity. The shield wall had won England battles for centuries. Now, for one last time, it would be asked to protect the kingdom itself. But while the ridge offered security, the valley below revealed something England had never faced before. As the mist thinned, William of Normandy's army emerged, disciplined, structured, unnervingly confident. Where the English line resembled a resolute but weary bulwark, the Norman forces looked like an engine of war, built and refined for precisely this moment. Archers adjusted their bowstrings with practiced ease. Infantry tightened their shields into neat formations. Breton auxiliaries muttered in their distinct tones, tightening belts and checking spearheads. Most striking of all were the cavalry knights mounted on muscular destriers, their armor catching the faint morning light, each lance like a metallic promise of violence, and in front of them all, calmly surveying the hill he intended to conquer, sat William. There was no hesitation in the Norman Duke, no trace of doubt on his hardened features. He had crossed the Channel under the banner of sacred oaths and papal blessing, convinced that the English crown was his by right. In his mind, Harold was not a king standing against him, he was a usurper. A man whose fall would restore the order William believed God himself had ordained. 2 commanders, 2 armies, 2 visions of authority and identity. And between them, the steep slope of Senlac Hill, a natural fortress shaped by the slow patience of time, now repurposed as the battleground that would decide the fate of a nation. For a long moment, nothing moved. The world held its breath. Housecarls tightened their grips. Horses pawed the earth. A brief gust of wind pulled at banners. Harold's golden fighting man of Wessex high on the ridge, William's papal banner billowing proudly in the valley. Every man present understood that whatever happened in the next hours would not be forgotten. The generations to come, villagers, kings, monks, poets, scholars would look back to this single morning as the hinge upon which England turned. The tension was almost unbearable. Even seasoned warriors later recalled the unnatural stillness, the quiet that pressed upon their chests like a physical weight. One English levy remembered hearing his own heartbeat louder than the murmur of the men around him. A Norman archer described how his hands trembled not from fear, but from the knowledge that he was about to take part in something far greater than any man could truly grasp. The mist continued to thin. The sun rose a fraction higher, and by mid-morning there was no more delay that strategy could justify. A Norman horn broke the silence. It pierced the air with a long, rising nota summons to battle, a declaration that the waiting was over. The English lifted their shields. The Normans knocked their arrows. Horses shifted into formation, and in that instant the quiet morning shattered. The ridge braced. The valley surged. History began to move. Senlac Hill, the last refuge of an old England, was about to become the birthplace of a new one forged not by destiny alone, but by the clash of iron, the cries of dying kings, and the brutal resolve of men who believed with every breath that the ground beneath their feet would decide the future of an island. The storm had begun. If Senlac Hill was the stage upon which England's fate would be decided, then the two armies gathered there were the actors of two very different worlds, shaped by centuries of tradition, belief, and warfare. To understand the battle that followed, one must first understand the men who fought it. In the cultures that had forged them long before the first arrow flew, for the Anglo-Saxons standing along the ridge, war was not a profession, it was an identity. Their warrior ethos had grown from the soil of an island shaped by migrations, invasions, and kinship. They were men of oath and allegiance, bound to their lords through personal loyalty as much as through royal command. Harold's housecarls, in particular, represented the pinnacle of this tradition, elite fighters trained since youth, wielders of the fearsome Danish axe, sworn to protect their king with an unwavering ferocity. These were not mercenaries. They were not career soldiers. They were extensions of Harold himself, his shield, his sword, his honor embodied in flesh and iron. Behind them, the levied forces of shires and towns held their spears with a mixture of pride and dread. These were farmers, craftsmen, sailors, and minor landholders who had left their fields and families at the call of duty. Their equipment varied in quality. Their experience varied even more. Yet they shared one belief, that Harold was their rightful king, and that England belonged to those who had lived, farmed, and died upon its land for centuries. Battle, for them, was a defense of home, and there is no stronger motivator than that. Their formation, the shield wall, reflected this spirit. When Anglo-Saxons fought, they did so as a single organism, a wall of oak and iron, each man supporting the one beside him. It was a system built not on individual brilliance, but on collective resolve. Its strength lay in unity, discipline, and the refusal to break rank. But across the field stood something entirely different. The Norman army was not a wall. It was a machine. William's force represented the cutting edge of continental warfare, an army built upon hierarchy, technology, training, and tactical sophistication. Where the Anglo-Saxons embodied steadiness, the Normans embodied movement. They were not an immovable object, but an unstoppable force. The Norman cavalry was the envy of Europe. Knights, clad in chainmail and mounted on powerful destriers, fought as a coordinated unit. They understood charges, retreats, reformations, and wedge formations. They used momentum as a weapon, shock as a tactic, fear as an ally. Unlike the English warriors who fought primarily on foot, these knights were trained from childhood to control a horse as an extension of their own bodies. Their lances could drive through lines. Their swords could cut down the unarmored. Their mobility allowed them to strike, withdraw, and strike again before infantry could adjust. Behind them stood disciplined infantry Normans. Frenchmen, Bretons each, cohort commanded by experienced officers. They carried kite shields and spears, their armor offering a balance between protection and agility. They were trained to respond to signals, to adapt to battlefield shifts, to fight in combination with archers and cavalry, and then there were the archers. Perhaps the most underestimated element of William's force, while Anglo-Saxon forces used archers sparingly, Normans deployed them in structured volleys. These men were skilled, coordinated, and strategically positioned. They offered something the English lacked, the ability to shape a battle. Before melee combat even began, the cultural divide between the two armies was profound. For the Anglo-Saxons, war had always been about standing one's ground. For the Normans, it was about breaking the enemy's ground. For Harold's men, honor lay in meeting the enemy face to face. For William's men, honor lay in victory achieved through whatever tactics were necessary. Even their banners told two different stories. Harold's standard, the fighting man of Wessex, represented lineage, continuity, and the old traditions of England. It was the banner of a people defending their home. William's papal banner, blessed in Rome, represented divine justification, conquest, and the idea that this campaign was not merely a political mission but a holy one, sanctioned by the Church. In many ways, the two armies reflected their leaders. Harold was a warrior shaped by the rhythms of England, by its political turbulence, its local loyalties, its long legacy of compromise and duty. He had earned his crown through skill, loyalty, and the respect of his peers. William was a product of Normandy's brutal, ambitious aristocracy, a man who rose from illegitimacy to ducal power through sheer iron will. He understood the calculus of force, the leverage of oaths, the necessity of fear. Their armies echoed their worldviews, Harold's grounded in the old, William's forged for the new. Yet despite their differences, both forces shared an unspoken truth. They knew this battle was final. There would be no negotiations, no retreat into diplomacy. The shield wall would hold, or England would fall. William's cavalry would break through, or his claim to the crown would collapse on foreign soil. This knowledge seeped into every man on the field. It was visible in the tightening of grips on spear shafts, the quiet murmurs of prayer, the nervous shifting of horses. The battle was not simply a contest of arms, it was a collision between civilizations, each believing that the world would be remade in its image after this day. Standing at the crest of Senlac Hill, Harold represented the last breath of a world that had endured for 6 centuries, waiting in the valley below. William represented the world that would shape the next 1,000 years. 2 armies, 2 cultures, 2 futures, only one would survive the day. The moment the Norman horn sounded, the stillness of Senlac Hill shattered. What had felt like the held breath of a kingdom became, in an instant, the roar of war. From the valley below, Norman archers stepped forward, planting their feet firmly into the damp earth. They raised their bows in one fluid motion, hundreds of strings pulled taut under the gray morning sky. Then, another horn. And the first volley soared. It should have darkened the air with death. But the arrows met the hill and lost. The steep slope of Senlac blunted their force. Many struck shields and bounced away harmlessly. Others thudded into the ground, rolling back down the incline. A few embedded themselves into the shields of the front ranks, but the wall held firm, absorbing the blows with the quiet confidence of men who had weathered storms before. A murmur rippled through the English line, not fear, but a spark of pride. The first test had come. They had passed. William quickly realized the flaw. His archers were firing too directly, too low. Arrows that should have cleared the ridge were dropping short, stripped of force by gravity. He barked new orders, and the second volley arced higher, but still the damage was minimal. The shield wall remained intact, the earth beneath it steady, the men behind it unbroken. So William shifted to the next phase. His infantry, Normans, Frenchmen, Bretons, advanced with measured steps. Shields raised, spears angled toward the enemy. They marched uphill, pushing through the churned soil, muscles straining against the gradient. The shield wall braced itself. Housecarls tightened their grips on axe handles. Firemen lowered their spears to create a bristling forest of points. When the lines collided, The sound was not a great crash, but a grinding. Crushing pressure, shield on shield, spear on wood, metal on bone. The infantry tried to pierce the English line, to peel back the first rank, to create the smallest crack. But the shield wall had been forged for this. The Anglo-Saxons fought like a single organism. Every shield supported the next. Every man leaned into the weight of the line. Every strike of a Norman spear met the stubborn defiance of men who refused to yield their footing. Housecarls swung their great axes in wide arcs, the blades cleaving shields, armor, and limbs alike. The force of each blow carried the echo of centuries of English warfare, raw, unadorned, brutally effective. Norman infantry began to falter. Their formations buckled under the relentless pressure. The uphill struggle exhausted them faster than expected. William's cavalry moved next. Knights spurred their destriers forward, hooves pounding the earth as they attempted to gather early momentum. But the slope betrayed them. Cavalry charges rely on speed, on the power generated by a horse at full gallop. Here, on the incline, the animals slowed, their weight working against them. By the time they reached the English line, their impact was blunted. Far from the devastating shock William needed, many Norman horses recoiled from the wall of shields. Others crashed into it, only to be struck down by the sweeping axes of housecarls who showed no mercy. For a moment, it looked as though the English might actually prevail. The shield wall held. Norman charges faltered. Archers failed to find their mark. And somewhere on that ridge, English hearts began to beat with dangerous confidence. The feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, this foreign invader would break himself against the hill and retreat back across the channel in shame. But battles do not turn on strength alone. They turn on psychology. They turn on timing. They turn on the unexpected. And William of Normandy was too experienced a commander to rely solely on brute force as the morning pulled toward midday. Disorder began to ripple along William's left flank, particularly among the Breton troops. Some accounts claim they panicked under the relentless English pressure. Others suggest the hill and shield wall had taken a greater toll than anticipated. The line wavered, then bent, then began to pull back down the slope. A murmur rose among the English ranks. Retreat? Already? It was all the temptation some firemen needed. Shouts too loud to triumphant broke across the ridge. A number of English warriors abandoned their positions, surging downhill in pursuit of the fleeing Bretons. They sought victory, glory, spoils. They thought the Normans were breaking, but this was the moment where history snapped, because the Breton retreat, whether accidental or deliberate, became the opening William had been waiting for. His English firemen chased them downhill. They lost their cohesion, their shield discipline, their positioning, and once separated from the main force, they stood exposed on open ground. William made his move. He ordered the cavalry to turn, not continue the retreat, but pivot sharply, like the swing of a great iron door. The knights wheeled around in perfect unison. The hunters had become the hunted. Norman horses thundered back up the slope, not in panic, but with precision. The English pursuers, scattered and breathless, realized too late what had happened. The cavalry smashed into them with a force the hill had earlier denied. Spears impaled, hooves crushed. Swords fell with ruthless rhythm. The firemen were slaughtered above them. The English shield wall watched in horror. Their line remained intact, but their confidence had cracked. A rule had been broken: you do not abandon the wall. Every warrior on that ridge knew the consequences of that mistake. The shield wall had not yet fallen, but it had been shaken not by might, but by manipulation. And William had learned something vital. The wall would not break from the outside. It would break from within. The Battle of Hastings was no longer just a contest of strength. It had become a contest of discipline, psychology, and endurance. And the day was far from over. As the afternoon sun lowered toward the horizon, the battle on Senlac Hill descended into something darker, something far removed from the disciplined formations and early maneuvers of the morning. What had begun as a clash of strategy had transformed into a test of endurance, willpower, and sheer human spirit. The air hung heavy with the metallic temps of blood, the choking dust of trampled soil, the cries of men who continued fighting long after their bodies should have given out. At the center of the English line, beneath the fluttering banner of Wessex, Harold Godwinson still stood. If exhaustion plagued him, he did not show it. If fear gnawed at him, he hid it well. This was no longer a battle between rival claimants to a throne. It had become a battle of survival, a king defending not just his title, but a world, culture, and a lineage stretching back centuries. Harold's armor was dented, his cloak torn, his hair matted with sweat and dust. Yet he remained unmistakable, a pillar around which the battered remnants of the shield wall continued to gather. For the housecarls who formed his personal guard, Harold was no longer merely a ruler. They saw in him the embodiment of England. As long as he lived, hope lived, but hope was thinning, repeated Norman assault archers. Infantry cavalry had ground down the once mighty shield wall. Gaps had opened. Bodies lay where shields once stood. Firemen, their legs trembling, clung to their positions out of loyalty rather than strength. Housecarls, grim-faced and unyielding, fought in smaller clusters. Striking with diminishing power, William sensed the moment. He had watched the English resist. He had watched them endure. And now he watched them fatigue. The Duke of Normandy ordered his archers to adjust their aim. Instead of firing flat into shields, they now arced their arrows high, letting gravity carry the shafts downward across the hilltop. It was a subtle shift, but devastating. Arrows began to fall like rain. Men raised shields to protect their faces, exposing legs and arms. Others crouched in panic, breaking formation. Cries of pain rippled down the line. And somewhere amid this storm of descending shafts, Harold's fate took shape. Though history remains maddeningly unclear about its exact form, 3 stories survive. The first story, the one etched into the Bayeux tapestry, claims Harold was struck in the eye. According to this version, Nero found a narrow gap in his helm and pierced him with almost surgical precision. Chroniclers later framed it as divine judgment, God punishing a man who had sworn an oath to William and broken it. But the tapestry's image is ambiguous, altered over centuries, and likely politicized. The second story, recounted by Norman writers, says Harold fell beneath the swords of 4 knights. These knights, fighting their way through the collapsing line, supposedly cut the king down, mutilating his body in the process. Some historians believe this version is closer to truth, especially given the brutality of the melee around the banner. The third story, rare, but lingering in quiet corners of the chronicle, suggests Harold may have been gravely wounded but still fighting when he was overwhelmed. A king dying on his feet, surrounded by loyal housecarls, refusing to fall until death compelled him? We may never know which version is true, but we know this: Harold did not flee. Kings who flee are remembered as cowards. Harold is remembered as a tragedy. As the fighting thickened around the Wessex banner, the English line collapsed inward, forming a desperate ring of resistance. Housecarls fought like men possessed, swinging great axes with the last reserves of their strength, cutting down knights who dared approach the banner. Their formation narrowed, then narrowed again, shrinking with each fallen warrior. Then a cry rose, shrill, desperate, unmistakable. The banner of Wessex shuddered, wavered, and fell. Harold's body lay either beneath it or near it, his blood staining the soil of Senlac Hill. Word spread like a shockwave. Some English warriors froze, stunned into disbelief. Others screamed in fury and hurled themselves at the Normans in suicidal charges. Most simply felt the final thread of hope snap inside them. For 6 centuries, Anglo-Saxon England had stood under kings of its own blood, kings who fought alongside their men, who held their thrones through consensus, tradition, and personal loyalty. With Harold's fall, that era ended. William's forces surged into the breach, pressing the advantage with ruthless precision. The remnants of the English army scattered. Housecarls fought to the last breath, refusing surrender. Firemen fled into the trees and hedgerows, pursued by cavalry whose hooves echoed across the ridge like the tolling of a great bell marking the end of an age. And somewhere amid the chaos, 4 knights searched for Harold's body. though some accounts suggest it was so mangled it could barely be identified. The king who had fought 2 invasions in 1 year. The king who had marched the length of England. Twice in a single campaign, the king who had held for hours against Europe's finest cavalry was dead. But his death did something extraordinary. It created a legend. A fallen king, pierced by an arrow of fate. A final stand beneath the ancient banners of Wessex. A heroic resistance crushed but never forgotten. Harold's death became more than a historical event. It became a symbol of a world's last breath. On the slopes of Senlac Hill, as shadows lengthened and the cries of battle faded, silence settled once more, but not the tense silence of dawn. This was the silence of something ending. The silence of a kingdom passing into memory. The silence of a man whose fall reshaped a nation. And while William's army advanced toward London, sure of victory, Harold remained on the field he had chosen, a fallen king, broken shield, and the first chapter in the birth of Norman England. When Harold fell, the battle did not end at once, but the world that had carried him to the ridge of Senlac Hill began collapsing almost immediately. Like a great hall whose central pillar had been struck out from beneath it. His death was not simply the loss of a king. It was the unraveling of the entire structure upon which Anglo-Saxon England had stood for centuries, for hours. The shield wall had held with a solidity that astonished even the Normans. It had endured arrow storms, infantry charges, cavalry strikes, and waves of coordinated assaults. It had been chipped, bent, and battered, but never truly broken. Harold's fall changed everything. The moment word spread that the king was dead, tremor pulsed through the English ranks. Men looked to one another in disbelief, some refusing to accept it. Others frozen, as if the world had suddenly shifted beneath their feet. In Anglo-Saxon warfare, the king was not merely a figurehead or a distant commander. He was the anchor of morale, the embodiment of identity, the point around which the entire army coalesced. Without him, the line had no center. Without him, the wall had no spine. The Normans sensed this instantly. William, ever the opportunist, ordered a fresh wave of infantry forward. Some attacked with renewed confidence. Others shouted death to the Kingslayers. To further demoralize the English, and as they surged up the slope, they found fewer shields raised, fewer spears braced, fewer warriors capable of resisting their advance. The House Carls the last, professional corps of the English force, fought on with grim, almost ritualistic determination. These were men who had sworn personal loyalty to Harold, men who had guarded him in London, who had marched with him north and then south again, who had stood beside him in countless councils and halls. They refused to retreat, refused even to look behind them. Their world ended with Harold. And so they chose to stand precisely where he fell. Witnesses later described these final moments as almost mythic. A circle of housecarls surrounded the fallen king's banner, axes rising and falling in great sweeping arcs, cutting down any Norman knight who dared venture too close. Some fought with shields shattered, others with helmets dented or lost entirely. Blood soaked their tunics, but their expressions never faltered. This was not strategy. This was devotion. A warrior's defiance carved into the last minutes of a dying age, but devotion alone could not stop the tide. To the right of the collapsing line, the furred less trained, more fearful began to pull back. Not a rout at first, but a slow, reluctant retreat. They stepped away from the ridge, hoping to regroup in a lower field. Perhaps to find a new defensive position. Perhaps simply to survive. But retreat, once begun, is a difficult thing to halt. When the Normans pressed harder, these men broke. And once one section ran, another followed. Then another. What had been the steadfast heart of Anglo-Saxon resistance cracked, then fractured, then dissolved. The Normans poured through the gaps like water through breached stone. On the left flank, the Breton cavalry began pursuing fleeing warriors, cutting them down as they slipped on loose soil or tangled in shrubs. Some Englishmen threw their weapons away and fled into the Wealden forest, hoping its ancient trees would hide them. Others ran toward nearby villages, crying warnings that came too late to help anyone. The battlefield became a landscape of chaos. Men slipped in blood. Horses screamed as they stumbled over corpses. Shields lay abandoned like broken promises. Banners of local lords fell and were trampled into the dirt. Some English warriors, in desperation, attempted a last stand around a small rise on the ridge. They fought until they were surrounded, swinging with exhausted fury. But these pockets of resistance were swiftly overwhelmed. By late afternoon, the field that had been filled with the chanting of two armies now echoed with a different sound. The scattered sobs of survivors, the groans of the dying, the triumphant shouts of Normans who knew they had won not merely a battle, but a kingdom. In London, news traveled with terrifying speed. At first came rumors wild, contradictory, shapeless. Harold wounded, Harold victorious, William slain. Then, as messengers arrived breathlessly at gatehouses and taverns, the truth hardened into something no one wished to accept. The king was dead. The army destroyed. William was coming. Panic spread among nobles. Some discussed fleeing north to regroup around Edgar Theling. Others spoke of negotiating with William, surrendering before he reached the city. Common folk whispered prayers for deliverance. Monks in Westminster read omens into the darkening sky. England had not merely lost a battle. It had lost the foundation of its political identity. For 6 centuries, kings of Anglo-Saxon blood had ruled with a blend of consensus, custom, and charisma. They had gathered their strength from local loyalties, from assemblies of nobles, from the support of warrior elites whose roots ran deep into the fabric of the land. Now, the structure shattered in a single afternoon. The ridge where Harold fell marked not only the end of his reign, but the end of England, as it had been known, its aristocracy, its language, its laws, its architecture. Its relationship to Europe, all of it, would be reshaped by the man now marching toward London. And as shadows lengthened across the battlefield, and the crows descended upon the still warm bodies, one truth became undeniable. Anglo-Saxon England had died on Senlac Hill. The New England had not yet been born. That birth lay in the hands of the victor, and William the Conqueror was already on the road. As night crept across the Sussex countryside on the 14th of October, 1066, Senlac Hill no longer resembled a battlefield. It resembled a graveyard, quiet, broken, and littered with the remnants of a world that no longer existed. The last rays of evening light fell upon shattered shields, torn banners, and the unmoving bodies of warriors who had held the ridge for hours with a determination that would echo far beyond their defeat. Somewhere among the fallen lay Harold Godwinson, the last crowned king of Anglo-Saxon England. Around him, his housecarls lay in concentric circles, so even in death they refused to allow the Normans to reach him easily. Their loyalty did not save their kingdom, but it ensured that Harold's end would be remembered not with shame, but with a tragic dignity unmatched in the annals of English warfare. Yet even the silence of this ancient ridge could not contain what was already rising beyond it. For while England mourned, William of Normandy prepared to claim what he believed had always been destined for him. He did not linger long on the hill. The work of conquest had only begun. The march to London. In the days following the battle, William advanced cautiously but relentlessly toward the English capital. The road was lined with towns and villages, unsure whether to resist or submit. Many surrendered before he even arrived. Others were punished severely for resistance. William understood the psychology of power. Mercy was offered to those who bowed early. Terror awaited those who hesitated. London itself was divided. Some nobles argued for a continued resistance under Edgar Theling, the last male descendant of the House of Wessex. Others understood the stark reality. England had no army left. Its warrior elite had fallen at Hastings. Its king lay dead. Its political structure had collapsed in a single afternoon. When William reached London, the city opened its gates. On Christmas Day, 1066, 2 months after Harold's fall, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony erupted in momentary chaos. when the Norman guards outside mistook the celebratory cheers for rebellion and began setting fire to nearby houses. It was a strange, unsettling coronation, one marked by smoke, confusion, and the sharp reminder that William ruled a people who had not chosen him. Yet the crown rested firmly on his head, and with that, the transformation began. A new aristocracy, William reshaped England more completely and more rapidly than any ruler before or after him. He replaced nearly every Anglo-Saxon earl and thane with Norman lordsmen bound to him personally, men whose fortunes depended entirely on his success. Lands that had been held by English families for generations were confiscated and redistributed. Castles rose across the landscape, stone, symbols of a new authority embedded into the soil itself in less than a generation. The old nobility was gone. A new ruling class, French-speaking, Norman-born, fiercely loyal to the crown, took its place. England had not merely changed rulers, it had changed its entire upper structure of society, law, language, and the structure of power before the Normans. English kings ruled through assemblies, councils, and consensus. After the conquest, authority flowed downward from the king in a clear hierarchical chain. Feudalism, introduced with precision by William, reorganized land ownership, military obligations, and legal authority. The English language itself transformed. French vocabulary poured into native English speech, law, justice, crown, court, soldier, castle, noble, parliament, words that form the backbone of modern governance all arrived through Norman rule. The architecture shifted to Anglo-Saxon timber halls gave way to Norman stone keeps. Churches rose in the Romanesque style, vast and imposing. Roads, markets, and administrative centers were reorganized under a system that connected England more closely with continental Europe than ever before. William's greatest administrative achievement, the Domesday Book of 1086, recorded every field, every mill, every household, every acre of England. Nothing like it had ever existed on the island. It marked the moment England became not only conquered, but measured, catalogued, and systematised. A medieval census, yes, but also the final stamp of Norman authority. The end of one England, the beginning of another herald's fall, was not just the death of a king, it was the death of an era. Anglo-Saxon England, the world of shield walls, wooden halls, local power, shared governance, and ancient kinship traditions ended on Senlac Hill. In its place rose Norman England, centralized, fortified, European, feudal, and ambitious. The shock waves of Hastings shaped the English monarchy, the aristocracy, the language, the legal system, the landscape, the very idea of England as a unified kingdom for a millennium afterward. England would speak with a Norman-influenced tongue, govern with Norman-derived institutions, and remember the events of 1066 as the hinge point of its identity. Even today, nearly every English-speaking person on Earth carries the linguistic legacy of William's conquest in their daily speech. When we say armor, judge, kingdom, battle, loyalty, noble, soldier, or victory, we speak with the echoes of 1066. This was not just a change of rulers, it was a cultural earthquake, a reforging of an island, a New England shaped by conquest, steeled by struggle, emerged from the ashes of Senlac Hill. As William rode into London under the cold winter sky, the last embers of the old England faded behind him. The crowns of Wessex and the house of Godwin lay buried with Harold on a blood-soaked ridge. Ahead of the Norman duke stretched a kingdom he would rebuild in his own image, stone by stone, law by law, word by word. 1066 was not merely a year. It was the moment England became the England we recognize today. A single battle rewrote its rulers, its language, its architecture, its justice, its destiny, and though nearly 1,000 years have passed, the shadow of Hastings still lies quietly across the English landscape. This is where Anglo-Saxon England ended. This is where Norman England began. This is where history itself turned a page. And with that, the story of 1066 is complete.